Let's get to this week's starts and sits. Week 6 quarterback. Who are we starting?
Kirk Cousins, he's back in our good graces. And, he was available on a lot of waiver wires because he had such a slow start to the season, Lindsay. But last week he went off. He had nearly 40 fantasy points. This week he's got the Carolina Panthers. They've allowed 11 touchdowns and an average of right around 19 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks. And you're going to like this one. Caleb Williams, you could start him. Another player who might have been on the waiver wire heading into the week. He had a very good game last week, 23.6 points. He's got the Jaguars. They've allowed the most fantasy points to quarterbacks so far this season. So Caleb Williams, that's right. If you have Patrick Mahomes or another quarterback who's on a bye, he is a viable starter this week.
Who are we sitting?
Trevor Lawrence against the Bears. And he had a good game. He had his best game in like a year. 371 yards, 2 touchdowns against the Colts, but now he's got Chicago. This is not a good matchup. They've allowed the fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. You can run on them. You don't throw on Chicago's defense. And then Justin Herbert against the Broncos. Listen, we predicted this. He's not good from a fantasy perspective at this point. He's not a mobile type running sort of quarterback. And so his numbers are down. He's got the Broncos this week on the road. Their defense, 11.8 points per game allowed to quarterbacks this season. And not for nothing, Lindsay, I know you love Justin Herbert, but it might be time to thinking about cutting him.
Who are we starting at running back?
I like DeAndre Swift. You want to talk about a Swift turnaround from a fantasy perspective? 19.4 combined points in his first 3 games. In his last 2, almost 50. The Jaguars have allowed 13 plus fantasy points to 5 different running backs. Dare I say it's going to be 6 this week. Start DeAndre Swift and start Tony Pollard against the Colts. Pollard, 15 plus points in 3 of his first 4 games. And the Colts have given up 25 plus points to 2 different running backs this year, including Tank Bigsby, who went off for almost 26 last week. So Tony Pollard is in a really good spot to start him.
Who are we sitting at running back?
I don't like Ramondre Stevenson this week. Last week, we know what happened. A lot of us got burned, including myself, because Gerard Mayo said that he was getting benched and he still ended up having a very good game. But when you look at his numbers and you look near the bottom of the league in rush expected points added, Stevenson's right down there. He's still got ball security issues. And oh, by the way, Houston has allowed the 7th fewest fantasy points to running backs. And I also worry about a negative game script here. So I would beware Stevenson if you've got to play him as a flex. I understand. Rashad White, same kind of thing. If you're in a PPR league and you got to play him as a flex, I understand. But folks, he has failed to score more than 10.4 points in all but 1 game. His rushing EPA is negative 9.8. He's averaging 3.7 yards per rush. The Saints, even though they did give it up to Kareem Hunt last week, they can be tough on running backs. Rashad White is a sit-em for me. And to be quite honest with you, Lindsay, until we see some signs of life, he may stay there.
From a wide receiver standpoint, who are we starting?
2 players in the same game. First, Terry McLaurin, who's been on fire, 18 plus points in 2 of his last 3 games. He's got the Ravens this week. We all know what the Ravens defense can and can't do against perimeter receivers. Did you watch last week? Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, they scored more than 70 combined points against this defense. So McLaurin is going to be in your lineup. And so is Zay Flowers. And I like Zay Flowers last week. He had a good game. Now, he's been inconsistent, but he has scored 19 or more points in 2 of his last 4 games. And the Commanders defense has surrendered a league high 10 touchdowns and the 7th most points to wide receivers. So Zay Flowers is in that wide receiver 2 flex conversation.
How about the sits?
George Pickens, who I had as a sit last week against my beloveds, he did not have a great game. He has scored fewer than 11 points in 3 of his first 4. He had 5.6 last week against Dallas, which is not good. Now, you may think, wait a minute, Fabs, this is the Raiders, but they've actually given up fewer than 80 receiving yards per game, and they've only given up 1 touchdown to a wide receiver who started his route on the perimeter. So keep that in mind. This is also a game that's got a 36.5 point total, so it will not be a high-scoring game.
What about tight end? Who are we starting?
Brock Bowers against the Steelers. It's crazy, right? You've said this in the past, too. Last year, Sam Laporta, number 1 tight end in fantasy football, rookie. This year, right now, Brock Bowers, number 1 tight end in fantasy football. He's a rookie. Now, he has been held to single digits in 2 of his last 3 games, but he did have 18 points in 2 of his 4. So this is still a guy who give you great numbers. He's got the Steelers this week. The Steelers have played 2 fantasy relevant tight ends, Jake Ferguson, Kyle Pitts. They both scored double digits. So Brock Bowers is going to be in play, and Devontae Adams, of course, will not be in play for Las Vegas. And then Tucker Kraft. Now, last week you could say I was chasing the points, but I told you to play him and he went off. 88 yards, 2 touchdowns, 24.8 points. And he's had now 42 combined points in the last 2 weeks. While the matchup might not be great on paper against the Cardinals, they did give up 20 points to George Kittle last week. And while Tucker Kraft is hot, I continue to ride him because the tight end position, Lindsay, as you know, is a dumpster fire.
Who are we sitting?
Mark Andrews. Listen, I know he had a good game last week, but it was 9.5 points. That's not that great. It's Mark Andrews. And Isaiah Likely was better. Charlie Kohler got into the end zone last week, and the Commanders have allowed double digits to just 1 tight end this year. So their defense has been pretty tough on tight ends. So Mark Andrews is going to be a fade. And now this one here, you may think I'm nuts, and I know you got to play him. Listen, I have him. I got to play him. Duncan Kidd has not been great this year. Through 5 weeks, he's been held to single digits 4 times. He's averaging 7.5 points per game. Like, that's not good. And even last week where the Bills didn't have Khalil Shakir, he had 5.4 points. There's nothing that tells me Dalton Kincaid's going to have 12 points this week or 15 points this week. His ceiling might be 8. And while that's pretty good at tight end, it's not what we were hoping for when we drafted Dalton Kincaid. So I know you probably got to play him, folks, but temper expectations.